The sound of breaking glass followed by cruel laughter was what first caught Finn O'Brien's attention as he rode his chestnut mare down the dusty main street of Helena, Montana Territory, on that sweltering afternoon in July of 1883. He pulled his horse to a stop outside Miller's General Store, where a crowd had gathered, their faces twisted with amusement at something happening inside the wooden building with its peeling paint and crooked sign. Finn dismounted slowly, his boots hitting the packed dirt with a soft thud. At 26 years old, he had seen enough cruelty in his years working cattle ranches across Montana Territory to recognize the sound of mockery when he heard it. His jaw tightened as he tied his horse to the hitching post, the leather reins warm from the July sun that beat down mercilessly on the small mining town nestled in the Rocky Mountains. Inside the store, a young woman stood behind the counter, her cheeks flushed red as three men leaned against the wooden surface, their voices raised in exaggerated mimicry. She had dark auburn hair pulled back in a practical bun, and her brown eyes were bright with unshed tears that she was fighting hard to contain. She wore a simple cotton dress the color of faded cornflowers, and her hands gripped the edge of the counter so tightly her knuckles had turned white. "Say it again," one of the men jeered, slapping the counter with his palm. "Tell us about them there pickles you got for sale." His companions erupted in laughter, and several townspeople who had crowded into the store joined in. "Please," the young woman said, her voice carrying the distinct rolling sounds of a Scottish accent, "I am just trying to work. The pickles are 15 cents for the jar." The men exploded with renewed laughter, and one of them, a rail-thin man with a patchy beard, mimicked her pronunciation in a cruel exaggeration. "The pickles air 15 cents," he said in a mockery that bore no real resemblance to her actual speech. "Where in blazes did old Miller find you? You sound like you got a mouth full of rocks." Finn pushed through the crowd, his broad shoulders making it easy to move the gathered onlookers aside. He was tall, standing just over 6 feet, with sun-weathered skin and eyes the color of storm clouds. His dark hair needed a cut, curling slightly at the edges beneath his worn Stetson, and several days' worth of stubble shadowed his jaw. He had the build of a man who spent his days in hard labor, all lean muscle and strength, earned through years of breaking horses and herding cattle across the rugged Montana landscape. "Seems like you boys got nothing better to do than harass a woman trying to earn her living," Finn said, his voice carrying a quiet authority that made 2 of the 3 men step back instinctively. The rail-thin man turned, sizing Finn up with bloodshot eyes that suggested he had already spent considerable time at the saloon despite it being early afternoon. "This ain't your concern, Cowboy. We're just having a bit of fun with the Scottish girl. She talks funny, case you hadn't noticed." "I noticed she talks different than you," Finn said evenly, his hand resting casually near his hip where his Colt revolver sat in its holster. He was not a violent man by nature, but he had learned long ago that sometimes the mere suggestion of force was enough to diffuse a situation. "Different doesn't mean deserving of disrespect." The young woman behind the counter looked at Finn with surprise, her lips parting slightly as if she wanted to speak, but could not find the words. Up close, Finn could see the delicate dusting of freckles across her nose and cheeks, and the way her chest rose and fell with quick, anxious breaths. She was pretty, he realized, though that was not why he had intervened. He had intervened because it was the right thing to do, and because his mother had raised him to stand up for those who could not easily stand up for themselves. "This ain't worth my time," the rail-thin man muttered, though his eyes flashed with anger at being called out. "Come on, boys. Let's leave the cowboy to his foreign sweetheart." The three men shuffled out, but not before the rail-thin man knocked over a display of canned goods near the door, sending several tins clattering across the wooden floor. The crowd dispersed with them, disappointed that the entertainment had ended, leaving Finn alone with the young woman in the suddenly quiet store. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The woman's hands still gripped the counter, and Finn could see them trembling slightly. He removed his hat, holding it in both hands in front of him, a gesture of respect his father had taught him years ago back in Texas, before the consumption had taken both his parents. "Are you all right, miss?" he asked gently. She nodded, but then shook her head, and finally she released the counter and pressed her palms against her eyes. "I am fine," she said, her accent rolling the R in fine in a way that Finn found unexpectedly pleasant. "Thank you for your help. You did not have to do that." "I know I didn't have to," Finn said, "but seemed like the right thing to do." He paused, then added, "My name is Finn O'Brien. I work at the Double R Ranch about 10 miles west of here." The woman lowered her hands, and Finn saw that she had composed herself, the tears pushed back through sheer force of will. "Bridget Sinclair," she said, offering her hand across the counter in a businesslike manner. "I arrived in Helena 3 weeks ago from Edinburgh. Mr. Miller hired me to help run his store while he recovers from a broken leg." Finn shook her hand, noting the calluses on her palm that spoke of hard work and the firm strength in her grip. "Edinburgh," he repeated. "That's in Scotland." "Aye," Bridget said, then seemed to catch herself. "Yes, it is. I came to America to live with my uncle, but when I arrived in Helena, I learned he had passed away 2 months prior from a mining accident. Mr. Miller was kind enough to offer me employment and a room in the back of the store until I can earn enough to afford better lodgings." There was a matter-of-fact quality to the way she relayed this information, as if she had told the story enough times that it had lost some of its emotional weight. But Finn could hear the loneliness beneath her words, the displacement of someone who had crossed an ocean seeking family, only to find herself entirely alone in a rough mining town in the Montana Territory. "I'm sorry about your uncle," Finn said sincerely. "Mining is dangerous work. Too many good men lost to cave-ins and explosions." Bridget nodded, her brown eyes meeting his. "Did you need to purchase something, Mr. O'Brien, or did you just come in to rescue me?" There was the faintest hint of humor in her voice, and Finn found himself smiling. "Well, I could use some tobacco if you have it," he said. "And maybe some of those pickles at 15 cents a jar." For the first time since he had entered the store, Bridget smiled. It transformed her face completely, lighting up her features and making her eyes crinkle at the corners. "I can help you with both of those things," she said. Over the next several weeks, Finn found himself making the 10-mile ride into Helena far more frequently than his job strictly required. The Double R Ranch kept him busy from dawn until dusk most days, working alongside a dozen other ranch hands to manage the 2,000 head of cattle that the ranch owner, Robert Redding, had built his fortune on. But Finn would volunteer for any errand that took him into town, whether it was picking up supplies, delivering messages, or simply checking on a piece of equipment that the ranch blacksmith needed from the Helena metalworker. Each time he came to town, he made sure to stop at Miller's General Store. Sometimes he bought things he genuinely needed: tobacco, new work gloves, ammunition for his rifle. Other times he made up excuses, purchasing items he did not particularly need simply to have a reason to speak with Bridget Sinclair. She was always polite, always professional, but Finn noticed things about her that he suspected others missed. He noticed how her shoulders would tense whenever the bell above the door rang, anticipating more mockery. He noticed how she kept her responses short with most customers, as if minimizing her speech would minimize their opportunity to ridicule her accent. He noticed the way she would stand a little straighter when he entered, and how a genuine smile would replace her careful, neutral expression. They talked during these visits, brief conversations conducted across the counter between Bridget helping other customers. Finn learned that she was 23 years old, that she had worked in a textile factory in Edinburgh, before saving enough money for passage to America, and that her mother had died giving birth to her, while her father had raised her alone until his death from fever when she was 17. She learned that Finn had been working ranches since he was 14, that he had a gift for working with horses that other men found difficult or dangerous, and that he sent most of his wages back to his younger sister in Texas, who was raising 2 children alone after her husband had been killed in a bar fight. On a Thursday morning in late August, Finn rode into Helena under threatening gray clouds that promised rain. The air had that electric quality that comes before a storm, and the wind picked up dust devils in the street that spun and danced before collapsing. He tied his horse outside the general store and entered to find Bridget arranging a new shipment of fabric bolts on a table near the window. "Afternoon, Miss Sinclair," he said, and she turned, her face brightening when she saw him. "Mr. O'Brien," she said, "I did not expect to see you today." "Is everything well at the ranch?" "Everything is fine," Finn said. "Boss sent me in to pick up some new rope. We are fixing up the north pasture fence and ran short." Bridget nodded and moved behind the counter, pulling out a thick coil of hemp rope from a storage area below. As she set it on the counter, the bell above the door rang and 3 women entered. Finn recognized them as the wives of prominent Helena merchants, Mrs. Garrison, Mrs. Fletcher, and Mrs. Yates. They were dressed in fine dresses with elaborate bustles and carried parasols, despite the threatening weather, and they moved through the store with the confidence of women who considered themselves the social arbiters of the town. "We need silk thread in dark blue, Mrs. Garrison announced without preamble, not bothering with a greeting. She was a heavy-set woman in her 50s with a pinched expression that suggested she found most of life disappointing. "Of course," Bridget said quietly, moving to the thread display. "We have several shades of blue. If you could tell me which one you prefer." "The dark blue," Mrs. Garrison interrupted. "As I just said, do you not understand English?" Finn saw Bridget's jaw tighten, but she said nothing, pulling down 3 different spools of dark blue thread and bringing them to the counter. "Any of these would work nicely," she said. Mrs. Fletcher, a thin woman with sharp features, leaned toward Mrs. Garrison and said in a voice clearly intended to be overheard, "I heard Mr. Miller is thinking of letting her go when his leg heals." "Too many customers complaining they cannot understand a word she says." "I can understand why," Mrs. Yates added, examining a display of buttons with apparent fascination. "That accent is simply dreadful, like listening to someone gargle rocks." Bridget's face flushed red, but she kept her eyes down, focusing on wrapping the thread that Mrs. Garrison had selected in brown paper. Her hands moved mechanically, and Finn could see she was trying to make herself invisible, to get through the transaction without inviting more criticism. But Finn had heard enough. He stepped forward, positioning himself at the counter next to the 3 women, and said in a clear, carrying voice, "Funny you should say that, madam, because I have always thought Miss Sinclair's voice is the sweetest sound I know." The store went completely silent. Bridget's hands stilled on the brown paper, and she looked up at Finn with wide, shocked eyes. The 3 women turned to stare at him as if he had suddenly sprouted a second head. "I beg your pardon," Mrs. Garrison said icily. Finn met her gaze steadily. "You heard me correctly, madam. Miss Sinclair has a voice that puts me in mind of music, soft and lilting, with a warmth to it that makes even talk of rope and thread interesting. He turned to look directly at Bridget as he continued. In fact, I would say that riding into Helena and hearing her voice has become the best part of my week. Would not trade it for anything. Bridget's flush deepened, but now it was not from embarrassment. Her brown eyes searched his face as if trying to determine whether he was mocking her or being sincere. What she saw there must have reassured her, because a slow, wondering smile began to spread across her features. Mrs. Garrison made a sound of profound disgust. "Well," she said, snatching up her wrapped thread without paying, "I can see the standards in this establishment have fallen even further than I thought." She swept toward the door with her two companions following, and only turned back at the threshold to add, "We will be taking our business to the new store on Bridge Street from now on." The door slammed behind them, and the silence returned. Finn and Bridget stood looking at each other across the counter, and then Bridget said softly, "You did not have to do that. Those are important customers. Mr. Miller will not be pleased if they truly take their business elsewhere." "Then Mr. Miller is a fool," Finn said. "And I did have to do it because what they said was cruel and untrue." He paused, suddenly feeling uncertain. "Unless I overstepped, if I embarrassed you, I apologize. That was not my intent." "You did not embarrass me," Bridget said quickly. She came around the counter, standing close enough that Finn could catch the faint scent of lavender soap. "You defended me. Again. And you said something very kind. Did you mean it?" "Every word," Finn said. "Your voice is beautiful, Bridget. The way you speak, the music in it, it is like nothing I have ever heard before. Anyone who mocks it is a fool." Bridget's eyes glistened with tears, but these were different from the tears she had fought back during his first visit to the store. These were tears of relief, of gratitude, of something deeper that neither of them was quite ready to name yet. "No one has ever said anything like that to me," she whispered. "Not here, not in Edinburgh. Even back home, people would say I should soften my accent, make myself sound more refined. But you actually like how I sound." "I do not just like it," Finn said. "I love it." The word hung in the air between them, heavier than he had intended. They both felt the weight of it, the implication. Finn cleared his throat, suddenly aware that he was standing very close to her. Close enough to see the individual freckles scattered across her nose. Close enough to notice that her eyes were not simply brown, but had flecks of gold near the pupils. "I should pay for this rope," he said, stepping back and pulling coins from his pocket with hands that were not quite steady. Bridget returned to her position behind the counter, and her hands trembled slightly as she took his money and counted out change. When their fingers brushed during the exchange, both of them felt it like a spark of static electricity, sharp and undeniable. "Will you be coming to the town social on Saturday?" Bridget asked, as Finn gathered up the rope. "Mr. Miller says he is feeling well enough to mind the store for the evening, and he encouraged me to attend. He says I need to make more effort to become part of the community." She paused, then added with a wry smile, "Though I suspect some members of the community would prefer I stay away." "If you go, I will be there," Finn said, "and I would be honored if you would save me a dance." "I am not certain I know how to dance the American way," Bridget admitted. "In Scotland we danced reels and such. I do not know if it is the same here." "Then we will learn together," Finn said. "Or we will just make fools of ourselves together. Either way sounds fine to me." Bridget laughed, a sound of genuine delight that made Finn's chest feel warm. "Then I will save you a dance, Finn O'Brien." He left the store walking on air, the rope coiled over his shoulder, barely noticing when the threatening storm finally broke, and rain began to pour down in sheets. He was soaked to the skin by the time he reached his horse, but he could not stop smiling as he rode back to the ranch through the downpour. Saturday evening arrived with clear skies and temperatures that had cooled from the oppressive heat of August into something more bearable. The town social was being held in the community hall, a large wooden structure near the Helena courthouse that served multiple purposes: church services on Sundays, town meetings, dances, and the occasional traveling theatrical performance. Finn had spent more time than usual getting ready, washing thoroughly in the creek near the ranch bunkhouse and putting on his best shirt, a dark blue cotton one that his sister had sent him 2 Christmases ago. He had shaved carefully, borrowed pomade from another ranch hand to tame his unruly hair, and polished his boots until they gleamed. The other ranch hands had noticed his preparations and ribbed him mercilessly about having a sweetheart in town. But their teasing was good-natured, and several of them offered advice on how to impress a lady that ranged from sensible to absurd. The community hall was already crowded when Finn arrived, with lanterns hung from the rafters casting warm light over the assembled townspeople. A small group of musicians occupied one corner, consisting of a fiddler, a man with a guitar, and another with a harmonica. They were playing a lively reel, and several couples were already dancing, spinning and stepping in patterns that Finn vaguely remembered from other socials he had attended over the years. He scanned the room for Bridget, his height giving him an advantage in looking over the crowd. He spotted her near the refreshment table, standing alone and looking decidedly uncomfortable. She wore a dress he had not seen before, a deep green that complemented her auburn hair, which she had left partially down, the length of it falling in soft waves past her shoulders. She looked beautiful, and also very much like she wanted to disappear through the floor. Finn made his way across the room, politely declining an invitation to dance from Melissa Grant, the daughter of the local banker, who had been making her interest in him known for the better part of a year. When he reached Bridget, her face flooded with relief. "You came," she said, and he heard the genuine gladness in her voice. "I said I would," Finn replied. "Are you all right? You look like you are about to bolt." Bridget glanced around the room nervously. "Everyone is staring at me," she said quietly. "Or at least it feels that way. I have been standing here for 20 minutes, and no one has spoken to me except Mr. Miller before he returned to the store." Finn looked around and realized she was right. While people were not openly staring, there was a quality of deliberate ignoring happening, with groups of women pointedly turning their backs when Bridget looked their way, and men who would normally ask any unattached woman to dance giving her a wide berth. The cruelty of it made his jaw clench. "Then they are all fools," Finn said firmly. "And their loss is my gain because it means I get you all to myself for the evening." He offered his arm. "Would you like to dance, Miss Sinclair?" Bridget looked at the dancing couples with trepidation. "I truly do not know the steps," she said. "I will likely step on your feet repeatedly." "My feet have survived worse," Finn assured her. "Come on, just follow my lead, and if we make mistakes, we will make them together." She took his arm, and he led her onto the dance floor just as the musicians finished their current song and transitioned into a slower waltz. This was better, Finn thought. The waltz was simple enough that Bridget could follow along without too much difficulty. He placed one hand at her waist, taking her other hand in his, and began to guide her through the basic steps. She was right about stepping on his feet, doing so at least 3 times in the first minute, but Finn did not care. She was laughing softly at her own mistakes, and the nervous tension had left her shoulders. Up close, moving together to the music, Finn was hyper-aware of every point of contact between them. His hand at her waist, feeling the warmth of her through the fabric of her dress, her hand in his, small and work-roughened. the way she had to tilt her head back slightly to meet his eyes because of their difference in height. "You are doing fine," he said encouragingly as she stumbled slightly and recovered. "See, you are a natural." "You are a terrible liar, Finn O'Brien," Bridget said, but she was smiling. "But I appreciate the sentiment." They danced through 2 more songs, and with each one, Bridget grew more confident, her steps more assured. Other couples gave them space on the floor, and Finn was aware of the watching eyes, the whispered conversations behind hands. He knew what was being said. That the cowboy from the Double R Ranch was keeping company with the foreign girl who worked at Miller's store. Some of the talk would be merely curious, but some would be judgmental, categorizing Bridget as beneath their notice because of her accent and her immigrant status. Let them talk, Finn thought fiercely. He did not care what they thought. All that mattered was the woman in his arms, the way her brown eyes caught the lantern light, the sound of her laughter when he deliberately spun her in an exaggerated turn that was not part of any proper waltz. When the musicians took a break, Finn and Bridget stepped outside for some air. The night was cool, with a breeze coming down from the mountains that carried the scent of pine. Stars blazed overhead in the clear Montana sky, more stars than Finn had ever seen during his years in Texas. They walked a short distance from the community hall, away from the other couples who had also stepped out for air, until they reached a quiet spot near a stand of cottonwood trees. "Thank you for this evening," Bridget said, leaning against one of the trees and looking up at the stars. "I know it probably cost you something, socially speaking, to be seen with me so publicly." "It cost me nothing that matters," Finn said, positioning himself next to her against the tree. "And it gained me everything. I meant what I said in the store, Bridget. About your voice being the sweetest sound I know. But it is more than that. You are the strongest person I have met in a long time. You came all this way alone, lost your family, found yourself in a town that has not been kind, and yet you keep going. You keep showing up. That takes courage." Bridget turned to look at him, and in the moonlight, her face was luminous. "I do not feel strong," she said quietly. "Most days I feel like I am barely holding myself together. Do you know what it is like to speak and see people wince? To know that every time I open my mouth, I am marking myself as different as other. I have thought about trying to change how I speak, to make myself sound more American. But this is my voice. It is the voice my father heard, the voice that carries my mother's words even though I never knew her. If I change it, what do I have left of where I come from? You should never change it," Finn said with quiet intensity. He turned to face her fully and, without thinking about it, reached out to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear that had come loose from her pins. His fingers lingered against her cheek and she did not pull away. "Your voice is part of who you are. Anyone who cannot see the beauty in it is not worth your time or concern." They stood like that for a moment, his hand against her cheek, her eyes locked with his. The sounds of the social faded into background noise, the music and laughter becoming distant and unimportant. Finn could feel his heart pounding in his chest, could see the rapid flutter of Bridget's pulse at her throat. "Finn," she whispered, and there was a question in the way she said his name. He answered by leaning down slowly, giving her every opportunity to pull away, but she did not. Instead, she rose slightly on her toes, meeting him halfway. Their lips met softly, tentatively, a first kiss that was gentle and sweet and perfect. Finn felt something in his chest unfurl, some tightly held tension releasing. This was right. This was what he had been moving toward since the first moment he had walked into Miller's general store and heard cruel laughter directed at a woman who deserved only kindness. When they broke apart, Bridget's cheeks were flushed and her eyes were bright. "Well," she said, slightly breathless, "that was unexpected." "Was it?" Finn asked, allowing himself a small smile, because I have been thinking about doing that for weeks now. Have you? Bridget's own smile was impish now, some of her earlier nervousness completely gone. And here I thought you just really needed a lot of rope and tobacco. Finn laughed, the sound surprising him with its genuine joy. I needed a reason to see you, he admitted. The rope and tobacco were just convenient excuses. They returned to the social eventually, though both would have been content to stay under the cottonwood trees talking for hours. They danced several more times, and while the other townspeople still kept their distance, Finn noticed that a few of the younger ranch hands who knew him from town started greeting Bridget politely when they passed. It was a small thing, but small things mattered. Each act of basic human decency was a crack in the wall of isolation that Helena society had tried to build around her. As Finn walked Bridget back to the general store at the end of the evening, she said, "Will I see you again soon?" "Try to keep me away," Finn replied. "I have next Sunday afternoon off. Would you like to go for a ride? I could borrow a gentle mare from the ranch and we could pack a picnic lunch, get you out of the store for a few hours." "I would like that very much," Bridget said. They had reached the store and she stood on the front step, making her nearly eye level with him. "Good night, Finn." "Good night, Bridget." He kissed her again, a brief, soft press of lips that promised more to come, and then forced himself to step back and walk away before he could do something foolish like ask her to marry him right there on the spot after only a handful of encounters. The next few weeks established a pattern. Finn came to town every chance he got, and on his days off, he and Bridget would spend hours together. He taught her to ride, first on a gentle mare named Clover, and then, as her confidence grew, on more spirited horses. She proved to be a natural horsewoman, unafraid of speed or height, laughing with delight as they galloped across the open grassland outside Helena. They would pack lunches and ride out to places Finn had discovered during his 3 years working at the Double R Ranch. A meadow filled with wildflowers where deer would come to graze in the early morning. A creek with water so clear you could see trout swimming in the pools. A rocky outcropping that provided a view of the Helena Valley stretched out below, with the mining operations visible as dark scars against the green landscape. During these rides, they talked about everything. Finn told her about growing up in Texas, about his parents who had loved each other deeply and had instilled in both their children a sense of justice and fairness. He told her about his sister Catherine, who had married at 18 and found herself a widow with 2 children at 22. He told her about the guilt he felt sometimes, being so far away when Catherine needed help, even though his wages provided the money that kept food on her table. Bridget told him about Edinburgh, about the textile factory where she had worked 12-hour days from the time she was 15, breathing air filled with cotton dust that had killed several of her co-workers before they reached 30. She told him about her father, a stonemason who had possessed a beautiful singing voice and had filled their small home with music. She told him about saving every penny for 5 years to afford passage to America, about the terrifying ocean voyage that had taken 6 weeks, about her excitement at finally reaching Montana territory, only to learn that her uncle had died, and she was alone in a strange land. "Do you ever regret coming?" Finn asked one Sunday as they sat by the creek, their boots off and their feet dangling in the cold water. Bridget was quiet for a moment, considering the question seriously. "There have been days when I regretted it," she admitted. "Days when the mockery felt like too much, when I wondered if I should have just stayed in Edinburgh and continued working in the factory until the dust killed me too. But then I met you, and now I cannot imagine being anywhere else." Finn reached for her hand, lacing their fingers together. "I am glad you came," he said. "Selfishly, impossibly glad. I know your path here was hard and I wish it had been easier, but I cannot regret anything that brought you to Helena." As September gave way to October, the relationship between Finn and Bridget deepened. They were no longer tentative around each other, no longer unsure. When Finn came to town, he would often stay to help Bridget close up the store, and they would sit on the front step talking until the stars came out. He taught her about the constellations visible in the Montana sky, pointing out Orion's Belt and the Big Dipper and the North Star. She taught him Scottish folk songs, her voice rising sweetly in the evening air as she sang ballads about lovers separated by the sea and warriors fighting for lost causes. The townspeople's attitude toward Bridget began to shift, though slowly. Finn's obvious devotion to her made some people reconsider their harsh judgments. If Finn O'Brien, who was known as a good, honest, hard-working man, thought so highly of the Scottish girl, perhaps she deserved a second look. A few of the ranch wives started greeting Bridget on the street. The school teacher, Miss Abernathy, stopped into the store one day and had a long conversation with Bridget about education in Scotland versus America. Mr. Jennings, who ran the newspaper, asked Bridget if she would be willing to be interviewed about her experiences as an immigrant in Montana Territory. Not everyone softened their stance, of course. Mrs. Garrison and her circle of friends remained coldly hostile, and there were still those who muttered about impropriety and the unsuitability of foreigners. But these voices were becoming fewer and quieter, drowned out by the growing chorus of people who recognized Bridget's inherent worth. Mr. Miller's leg healed by mid-October, and there was a tense week when Bridget was uncertain whether he would keep her on at the store. But Miller, who had observed the gradual change in his customer base and had heard the positive comments about Bridget from several townspeople, offered her a permanent position with slightly higher wages. The relief on Bridget's face when she told Finn the news made his heart ache with protective tenderness. On a cold Saturday in late October, Finn rode into town with a specific purpose. He had spent the previous month's wages on a simple gold ring that he had special ordered from the jeweler in Helena. It was not fancy or elaborate, but it was solid and real, and represented every ounce of love he felt for Bridget Sinclair. He found her in the store restocking shelves with the methodical efficiency she brought to all her tasks. When she saw him, her face lit up in the way that never failed to make his breath catch. "Finn, I did not expect you today. Is everything all right?" "Everything is perfect," Finn said. "Or it will be if you will come outside with me for a moment. I have something I need to ask you." Bridget looked puzzled but intrigued. She called out to Mr. Miller, who was organizing receipts at the counter, that she was stepping out for a moment, and followed Finn onto the wooden boardwalk in front of the store. The October afternoon was crisp and clear, with golden leaves falling from the cottonwood trees that lined the street. The mountains in the distance were already capped with early snow, brilliant white against the blue sky. It was the kind of day that made Montana Territory feel like the most beautiful place on earth. Finn took both of Bridget's hands in his, and he saw her eyes widen as she realized something significant was happening. "Bridget Sinclair," he began, and then paused, his carefully prepared speech evaporating in the face of the actual moment. "I am not good with fancy words. I am just a ranch hand who is decent with horses and cattle. I do not have much to offer except hard work and honest wages, but I love you. I have loved you since the first moment I heard those ignorant fools mocking your voice and realized that they were too stupid to hear the music in it." Bridget's eyes were already shining with tears, but Finn pressed on. "You are the strongest, bravest, most beautiful woman I have ever known. Your voice is the sweetest sound in my world, and I want to spend the rest of my life hearing it. I want to come home to you every evening. I want to face whatever troubles come our way together. I want to build a life with you, Bridget. So I am asking, will you marry me?" He pulled the ring from his pocket, the small gold band catching the afternoon sun. Bridget looked at it, then at him, and tears were streaming down her cheeks now, but she was smiling the brightest smile he had ever seen. "Yes," she said, her accent thick with emotion. "Yes, Finn O'Brien, I will marry you. I love you so much I can hardly breathe with it sometimes. You saw me when I felt invisible. You valued me when others found me worthless. You love my voice when others mock it. How could I possibly say anything but yes?" Finn slipped the ring onto her finger with shaking hands, and then he was kissing her, right there on the main street of Helena, Montana territory, not caring who saw or what they thought. Bridget kissed him back with equal fervor, her hands fisting in his shirt, holding him close. When they finally broke apart, Finn realized they had attracted an audience. Several people had stopped on the street to watch, and he could see the range of reactions. Some smiled approvingly, others looked scandalized, still others seemed merely curious. But none of it mattered. Bridget had said yes, and that was all that counted. They were married 6 weeks later, in early December of 1883, in the community hall with Reverend Thomas presiding. It was a simple ceremony, attended by Mr. Miller, several of Finn's friends from the ranch, and a surprising number of townspeople who had come to respect Bridget over the past months. Miss Abernathy played piano, and Bridget wore a dress of cream-colored silk that had cost most of her savings but made her look like something out of a dream. Robert Redding, the owner of the Double R Ranch, attended the wedding and pulled Finn aside afterward with an offer. "I have been thinking about expanding operations," Redding said. He was a gruff man in his 60s who had made his fortune in cattle and was known as a fair employer. "There is a section of land about 5 miles north of the main ranch house that would be perfect for a smaller satellite operation. I need someone I trust to oversee it, someone who knows horses and cattle and can work independently. The job comes with a small house, higher wages, and a share of the profits from that section's cattle. Interested?" Finn did not need to think about it. "Yes, sir, very interested." "Good. You and your bride can move into the house after New Year. It needs some fixing up, but it is solid. Figure a man with a wife needs his own space, not a bunk in a crowded bunkhouse." The house, when Finn and Bridget first saw it in January of 1884, was rough but livable. It was a 2-room cabin made of logs chinked with mud, with a stone fireplace that needed some repair, plank floors that were reasonably level, and windows that only leaked a little air around the frames. It sat in a small valley surrounded by pine trees, with a creek running nearby and a stunning view of the mountains to the west. "It is perfect," Bridget said, standing in the middle of the main room and turning in a slow circle. "It is ours, Finn, our home." They spent the first months of their marriage making the cabin into a proper home. Finn repaired the fireplace and weatherproofed the windows, built shelves and a proper table and chairs, and put in a better door that fit the frame more snugly. Bridget sewed curtains from fabric she got at a discount from Miller's store, planted a kitchen garden that would bloom in the spring, and slowly accumulated the basic necessities of housekeeping: pots and pans, dishes, quilts, preserving jars. The work was hard, but they were happy. Finn would rise before dawn to work the cattle and horses in his assigned section, and Bridget would pack him lunches that he would eat sitting on horseback while surveying the herd. In the evenings, they would have dinner together at their handmade table, and afterward, Bridget would read aloud from books while Finn mended tack or oiled his saddle. She had a small collection of books that had belonged to her father, and she read with expression and emotion, her accent making even familiar stories sound new and interesting. On cold winter nights, they would lie together in their bed with extra quilts piled on top, talking about their dreams for the future. Finn wanted to eventually buy his own land, start his own ranch. Bridget wanted to see more of America, particularly the coast, since she had seen only the Atlantic during her arrival. They both wanted children, though neither felt the rush to start a family immediately. They were young, and there was time. Spring came to Montana territory with a rush of green growth and wildflowers, and with it came challenges. A late blizzard in April killed several calves, and Finn spent 3 days and nights in the saddle trying to rescue as many as he could. Bridget waited at the cabin, keeping coffee hot and worrying, and when Finn finally returned exhausted and half-frozen, she had a hot bath ready and warm food and helped him out of his ice-stiffened clothes with gentle hands. In May, a group of cattle rustlers tried to run off some of the Double R herd, and Finn and several other ranch hands tracked them for 2 days before recovering the stolen cattle. It was dangerous work, and Finn came home with a bullet graze on his arm that Bridget cleaned and bandaged with steady hands, even though her face was white with fear. "You could have been killed," she said quietly, as she wrapped clean cloth around his arm. "But I was not," Finn said, covering her hand with his. "I am right here and I am fine." "You are not fine, you are injured," Bridget said sharply, but her voice shook. "Do not make light of this, Finn. I cannot lose you. I crossed an ocean and lost everyone I ever knew, and then I found you. If something happened to you, I do not think I could bear it." Finn pulled her close with his good arm, holding her tight. "Nothing is going to happen to me," he promised, even though they both knew it was a promise he could not absolutely keep. The West was still wild, still dangerous. Men died from accidents, from violence, from simple bad luck. But he could promise to be careful, to come home to her every night he could, to fight like hell to stay alive because he had everything to live for. Summer brought easier times. The cattle were moved to higher pastures where the grass was thick and green, and Finn's job became more about maintaining fences and water sources than the intense daily work of spring. He taught Bridget more about riding and ranching, and she proved to be a quick study. She learned to rope, to recognize cattle by their brands, to spot signs of illness in the herd. Robert Redding was impressed, and he started paying Bridget a small wage to help with the books, tracking cattle sales and expenses in neat columns that made much more sense than the messy records the ranch had kept before. On Sundays, they would ride into Helena for supplies and to attend church, and these trips became less fraught with tension as Bridget became more accepted in the community. She would never be fully embraced by the social elite of Helena, but the working people of the town had come to appreciate her. She was known as honest and fair, someone who would give credit at the store when times were tight, and who never judged others for their circumstances. The fact that she had married a respected ranch hand and was clearly devoted to her husband also helped her social standing. On a warm evening in late July, as Finn and Bridget sat on their cabin's small porch watching the sun set over the mountains, Bridget said, "I have news." Something in her tone made Finn set down the bridle he had been mending and give her his full attention. "What kind of news?" "Good news," Bridget said, and she was smiling but also looked nervous. "Or at least, I think it is good news. I hope you think it is good news." "Bridget, you are making me anxious. What is it?" She took his hand and placed it on her still flat stomach. "We are going to have a baby. I am almost 3 months along. I wanted to be certain before I told you." For a moment, Finn could not speak. He looked down at his hand on Bridget's stomach, trying to comprehend that their child, was growing there. A wave of emotion hit him so hard it nearly knocked him breathless. Joy, fear, excitement, terror, love so intense it hurt. A baby, he finally managed. We are going to have a baby. In February, Bridget confirmed. Are you happy? Happy. Finn pulled her into his arms, careful not to hold her too tightly. Bridget, I am terrified and thrilled and happier than I thought possible. A baby, our baby. They held each other as the sun finished setting and the stars began to appear, talking about names and whether they hoped for a boy or a girl, and how they would need to expand the cabin to add another room. Finn felt the weight of new responsibility settling on his shoulders, but it was a good weight, a purposeful weight. He would work harder, save more, do whatever it took to provide for his growing family. The pregnancy progressed smoothly through the summer and into fall. Bridget continued helping with the ranch books as long as she felt well, and Finn became comically overprotective, worrying whenever she lifted anything heavier than a teacup. She tolerated his concern with patient amusement, though she did put her foot down when he suggested she should perhaps spend the last months of pregnancy in bed resting. Women have been having babies while working right up until labor since the beginning of time, she informed him tartly. I am not made of glass, Finn. I am perfectly capable of cooking dinner and mending clothes and keeping our home. In October, Finn's sister Catherine arrived from Texas with her 2 children, 9-year-old Thomas and 7-year-old Lucy. Catherine was a thin woman with Finn's dark hair and gray eyes, worn down by hard work and harder circumstances. Finn had invited her to come live with them, offering her a place to stay and help with the baby when it came. Catherine had accepted gratefully, tired of struggling alone in Texas. The cabin suddenly became crowded, with 2 adults and 2 children sharing the space, but they made it work. Catherine proved to be a treasure, taking over much of the household work as Bridget's pregnancy advanced, and helping Finn build a small addition onto the cabin that would serve as a second bedroom. The children were initially shy around Bridget, unsure what to make of her accent, but she won them over by teaching them Scottish songs and telling them stories about Edinburgh that made the city sound like something from a fairy tale. Winter came early in 1884, with snow falling in November and temperatures dropping well below freezing. Bridget grew larger and more uncomfortable, struggling to sleep as the baby pressed against her ribs and made breathing difficult. Finn would stay awake with her on bad nights, rubbing her back and reading to her until she could finally doze off. On a frigid night, in late February 1885, Bridget went into labor. It was a difficult birth that lasted nearly 20 hours, with Catherine and the doctor Robert Redding had insisted on bringing from Helena both attending. Finn paced outside the cabin despite the cold, unable to stay inside and listen to Bridget's cries of pain, feeling helpless and scared in a way he had never felt facing down cattle rustlers or blizzards. When the baby's first cry finally split the air, Finn nearly collapsed with relief. Catherine emerged from the cabin with a broad smile. You have a son, she announced, and Bridget is asking for you. Finn entered the cabin to find Bridget propped up in bed, pale and exhausted but smiling. In her arms was a tiny bundle wrapped in blankets, and when Finn approached, she pulled the blanket back to reveal a small red face with a shock of dark hair. Meet your son, Bridget said softly. I thought we might name him James after my father, James O'Brien. James, Finn repeated, carefully taking the baby from Bridget. The infant was so light, so fragile-looking, and Finn was terrified he might break him. But James settled into his arms as if he belonged there, his tiny fist waving in the air before finding his mouth. Hello, James. I am your father, and I promise I am going to do everything I can to be a good one." The months after James's birth were exhausting and wonderful in equal measure. The baby was healthy but demanded constant attention, and Bridget and Catherine took turns caring for him while also managing the household and the other children. Finn did what he could when he was not working, walking James around the cabin at night when he fussed, changing diapers with fumbling but determined hands, singing off key lullabies that somehow worked better than anyone expected. As spring arrived and James grew from a tiny infant into a chubby, smiling baby, Finn found himself reflecting on how much his life had changed. 2 years ago, he had been a solitary ranch hand with no prospects beyond his next paycheck. Now he had a wife he loved beyond measure, a son who made his heart swell every time he looked at him, a sister and nephew and niece who felt like the family he had thought lost forever. He had a home, a good job, a future that looked bright. One evening in late May, as they sat on the porch with James between them on a blanket, learning to sit up with wobbly determination, Bridget said, "Do you remember the first time you came into Miller's store, when those men were mocking me?" "Of course," Finn said. "How could I forget?" "I was so close to giving up that day," Bridget admitted. "I had been in Helena for less than a month, and I was already wondering if I had made a terrible mistake coming to America. The mockery was constant, and I felt so alone. And then you walked in and you stood up for me when no one else would. You changed everything, Finn." "You changed everything for me too," Finn said, reaching over to take her hand. "I was just going through the motions before I met you, working, eating, sleeping, repeat. But you made me want more. You made me believe I could have more. You told those awful women that my voice was the sweetest sound you knew," Bridget said, her eyes soft with memory. "No one had ever said anything like that to me. In Scotland, people told me to be quieter, to soften my accent, to make myself smaller and less noticeable. But you loved me exactly as I was. Do you know what a gift that is? To be loved as you are, not as someone wishes you would be." "You give me the same gift," Finn said. "You have never asked me to be anything other than what I am. A ranch hand with calloused hands and no formal education. You make me feel like I am enough." James chose that moment to topple over sideways on his blanket, and both parents laughed as they helped him sit back up. The baby grinned at them, showing his 2 new bottom teeth, and grabbed for Bridget's finger with his chubby fist. The years that followed were full of work and joy and the normal struggles of life in Montana Territory. The ranch prospered under Robert Redding's management and Finn's careful oversight of his section. Finn's wages increased, and he was able to save money toward his dream of eventually buying his own land. Catherine remarried in 1886 to a widowed rancher named Peter Wallace who had 3 children of his own. They moved to Peter's ranch about 15 miles away, but the families visited regularly, and Thomas and Lucy remained close to their Uncle Finn and Aunt Bridget. Bridget gave birth to a daughter in 1887, a tiny girl with her mother's auburn hair and her father's gray eyes whom they named Margaret, after Finn's mother. James, now a rambunctious toddler, was fascinated by his baby sister and would sit next to her cradle for hours, chattering to her in his own toddler language. Another son, David, arrived in 1889, completing their family. The children grew up speaking with a fascinating mix of accents, their mother's Scottish lilt blending with the Western drawl they picked up from their father and the other ranchers. Bridget never lost her accent, never tried to soften it or make herself sound more American. And true to his word, Finn never stopped thinking it was the sweetest sound he knew. In 1891, Robert Redding suffered a heart attack and died suddenly at the age of 68. His son William inherited the ranch, but William had no interest in ranching, preferring to live in San Francisco and manage the family's other business interests. He offered to sell Finn the section he had been managing, along with additional acreage, at a fair price with terms Finn could afford. After careful discussion with Bridget, Finn accepted and they became landowners, proprietors of the O'Brien Ranch. It was a smaller operation than the Double R, running about 300 head of cattle, but it was theirs. Finn worked harder than ever, building up the herd and the ranch's reputation. Bridget managed the business side, keeping meticulous books and building relationships with cattle buyers in Helena and as far away as Denver. Together, they made the ranch successful, earning enough to expand their cabin into a proper house with 4 bedrooms, a parlor, and a real kitchen. The children thrived. James grew into a tall, serious boy who loved horses and showed every sign of becoming an excellent rancher like his father. Margaret was clever and bookish, constantly reading everything she could get her hands on and talked about becoming a teacher. David was the wild one, always getting into trouble but with such charm that it was hard to stay angry at him. Bridget became a respected member of the Helena community, serving on the school board and organizing fundraisers for the church. The people who had once mocked her accent now valued her opinion and sought her advice. She never forgot the cruelty she had experienced when she first arrived, but she also never let it make her bitter. Instead, she went out of her way to welcome newcomers to Helena, particularly immigrants who struggled with the language or customs. She wanted no one else to feel as alone as she had felt in those early days. Finn and Bridget's love deepened with the years. They had their arguments, as all couples do, particularly about money when the ranch was struggling or about discipline when the children misbehaved. But they always came back together, always remembered that they were partners facing the world as a team. And at night, when the children were asleep and the ranch work was done, they would sit together on their porch, holding hands and talking, her voice still the sweetest sound in his world. In the spring of 1895, when James was 10, Margaret was 8, and David was 6, a Scottish family arrived in Helena from Glasgow. The family consisted of a husband and wife with 3 young children, and they had come to Montana Territory hoping to homestead, but found themselves struggling with the harsh reality of frontier life. The husband came to the O'Brien Ranch looking for work, and Bridget overheard him speaking to Finn at the barn. She came out of the house and greeted the family in Scots Gaelic, the language her father had sometimes spoken when she was very young, and that she had thought she had forgotten. The wife burst into tears of relief at hearing her native tongue, and the family poured out their story. They had been cheated by a land agent, had lost most of their savings, and were nearly destitute. Finn hired the husband on the spot, and he and Bridget offered the family the use of a small cabin on the ranch property until they could get on their feet. Over the following months, Bridget helped the wife adjust to life in Montana, teaching her the same lessons Bridget herself had learned through hard experience. She helped the children enroll in school and warned them about the mockery they might face, but also assured them that there were good people in Helena who would judge them by their character rather than their accent. Watching Bridget with the Scottish family, seeing her provide the help and understanding she had so desperately needed when she first arrived, Finn felt his love for her expand even further. This was who she was at her core, strong, compassionate, never forgetting where she came from, always reaching back to help others climb the same mountain she had conquered. One evening after the Scottish family had been settled for several weeks, Finn found Bridget sitting on the porch, looking out at the mountains with a contemplative expression. He sat down next to her, and after a comfortable silence she said, "I have been thinking about my journey." about how close I came to turning around and going back to Scotland in those first months. If those men had not been mocking me that day in the store, if you had not walked in exactly when you did, my whole life might have been different. I might have given up and gone home. But you did not give up, Finn said. Even without me, I think you would have found a way. You have always been stronger than you give yourself credit for. Perhaps, Bridget said, but it is easier to be strong when someone believes in you. When someone tells you that the thing others mock is actually beautiful. You gave me that, Finn. You heard music where others heard discord. You saw strength where others saw foreignness. You loved me when I felt unlovable. You were always lovable, Finn said. I just had the good sense to see it. He paused, then added, and your voice is still the sweetest sound I know. Even sweeter now than it was then, because it is the voice that comforts our children when they are hurt, that fills our home with songs and stories, that says my name in the morning and at night. That voice is my home, Bridget. Wherever in you are speaking, that is where I belong. Bridget turned to him with tears shining in her eyes. How do you always know exactly what to say? I do not, Finn said honestly. Most of the time I fumble around trying to express what I feel. But with you, it is easier. The words come because the feelings are so clear. They sat together in the fading light, hands clasped, watching the sun set over the mountains that had become their home. Inside the house, they could hear the children playing some complicated game that involved a lot of running and laughter. The cattle in the near pasture lowed occasionally, and the creek that ran past the house burbled softly. It was a symphony of familiar sounds, the music of the life they had built together. As the stars began to appear in the darkening sky, Finn thought about the improbable series of events that had led him to this moment. A young woman traveling alone across an ocean. A job opening at a general store. Cruel mockery that had happened to coincide with his ride into town. The choice he had made to intervene rather than walk past. Any one of those elements changed, and they might never have met. But somehow, against all odds, they had found each other. Two lonely people in a vast territory, connected by kindness and defended by love. The years continued to pass, bringing changes and challenges. Montana Territory became the state of Montana in 1889, though Finn and Bridget still sometimes called it the Territory out of habit. The wild frontier gradually became more settled, with more towns, more people, more civilization pushing back against the wildness that had once defined the West. The railroad expanded, making it easier to ship cattle and goods. Telephones arrived in Helena, and then electricity, marvels that the children accepted as normal but that still amazed Finn and Bridget. The O'Brien Ranch continued to prosper, and Finn and Bridget were able to buy additional land, expanding their holdings until they ran nearly 1,000 head of cattle across 2,000 acres. They hired ranch hands to help with the work, and Finn became known throughout Montana as a fair employer and an expert horseman. Bridget's business acumen kept the ranch profitable even through lean years when cattle prices dropped or drought affected the grass. James grew into a fine young man who took over more and more of the ranch operations as he got older, displaying a natural talent for the work. Margaret indeed became a teacher, attending the normal school in Bozeman before returning to Helena to teach at the elementary school. David, true to his wild nature, left Montana for a few years to work on ranches in Wyoming and Colorado, before returning home with a wife and a new appreciation for his family's land. In 1905, Finn and Bridget celebrated their 22nd wedding anniversary with a large party at the ranch. Friends and neighbors came from miles around, and the celebration lasted well into the night with music and dancing, and an abundance of food. Catherine and Peter were there with their combined brood of children, now mostly grown. The Scottish family they had helped years ago came, now prosperous farmers with their own land. Half the town of Helena seemed to attend, a testament to the respect and affection the community felt for the O'Briens. At one point during the party, Finn and Bridget slipped away from the crowd, walking down to the creek where they had so often sat during their courtship. They were both in their 40s now, with silver threading through Bridget's auburn hair and lines crinkling around Finn's eyes. But when they looked at each other, they saw the same people who had fallen in love 22 years ago. The shy young woman with the beautiful accent and the cowboy who had recognized her worth. 22 years, Bridget marveled. Sometimes it feels like just yesterday that you walked into Miller's store. Other times it feels like I have known you my entire life. I feel the same way, Finn said. He put his arm around her waist and she leaned into him, comfortable and familiar. Do you ever think about what your life would have been like if you had stayed in Scotland? I used to, Bridget admitted. In the early years when things were hard, I would sometimes wonder. But now I cannot imagine it. This is my home, Finn. This ranch, this state, this country. But most of all, you and our children. That is where home is. You made a brave choice coming here, Finn said. A lot of people would not have had the courage. Or the stubbornness, Bridget said with a laugh. My father used to say I was too stubborn for my own good. That I would insist on swimming upstream even when there was a perfectly good path along the bank. That stubbornness served you well, Finn said. You did not let cruel people drive you away. You did not let hardship defeat you. You built a life here through sheer determination. He paused, then added, and I got to be part of that life. I got to walk beside you. That is the greatest gift I have ever received. They stood by the creek for a long time, listening to the water and the distant sounds of music and laughter from the party. The Montana sky was brilliant with stars, the same stars they had looked at together for more than 2 decades. So much had changed, but the fundamental truth of their relationship remained constant. They loved each other, supported each other, and faced the world as partners. When they finally returned to the party, Margaret was singing, her voice carrying clearly across the ranch yard. She was singing a Scottish ballad that Bridget had taught her, and her accent as she sang carried her mother's lilt. Finn looked at Bridget and saw tears in her eyes, but they were happy tears. She sounds like me, Bridget whispered, like I sounded when I first arrived. She sounds beautiful, Finn said, just like her mother. The party wound down eventually, with guests departing into the night and the family helping to clean up. When everyone had finally left, and the children had gone to their own homes or to bed, Finn and Bridget sat together on their porch, a ritual they had maintained for years. The night was cool and Bridget had a shawl wrapped around her shoulders. Finn held her hand, his thumb rubbing gentle circles on her palm. Thank you, Bridget said suddenly. For what? Finn asked, surprised. For everything. For defending me when I needed it. For loving my voice when others mocked it. For building this life with me. For being the man you are. She turned to look at him, her brown eyes serious in the moonlight. I could not have done any of this without you, Finn. I would not have wanted to. Right back at you, Finn said softly. You made me better than I was. You made me want to be better. And you gave me a family, a home, a purpose beyond just surviving day to day. He lifted her hand to his lips and kissed it gently. I love you, Bridget O'Brien. I loved you the first day I met you, and I will love you until my last breath. And I love you, Bridget said, my brave cowboy who heard music where others heard noise. They sat together in comfortable silence, 2 people who had found each other against all odds in a wild and sometimes cruel place. They had built something beautiful together, a ranch, a family, a love that had endured through hardships and flourished through good times. The sound of Bridget's voice still made Finn's heart sing, still was the sweetest sound he knew after more than 2 decades of marriage. As the years continued to roll by, that never changed. Through illness and health, through prosperity and lean times, through the joys of grandchildren and the sorrows of losing friends, Finn always thought Bridget's voice was the most beautiful sound in the world. And Bridget never forgot that she had been seen, valued, and loved exactly as she was by a man who looked past what others mocked to see her true worth. Their love story became something of a legend in Helena, Montana. People would point out the O'Brien Ranch and tell newcomers about how it had been started by a cowboy and a Scottish immigrant who had fallen in love despite the prejudice of the times. They would talk about how Finn had stood up for Bridget when others mocked her accent, and how his declaration that her voice was the sweetest sound he knew had become a romantic touchstone for the community. Young couples would sometimes come to Finn and Bridget for advice, wanting to know the secret to a long and happy marriage. Finn's answer was always simple: find someone whose voice you want to hear every day for the rest of your life. If you can do that, everything else will work itself out. Bridget's answer was equally simple but profound. Choose someone who loves you as you are, not as they wish you would be, and then work every day to deserve that love by giving it back equally. In 1920, Finn and Bridget celebrated their 37th wedding anniversary quietly at home, now surrounded by a large extended family that included 3 children, their spouses, and 8 grandchildren. James ran the ranch operations completely now, with Finn serving more as an advisor than an active manager. Margaret was the principal of Helena Elementary School, having risen through the ranks over the years. David and his wife ran a successful horse breeding operation on adjacent land they had purchased. Finn was 63 now, his hair completely silver, his body bearing the aches and pains of a life spent in hard physical labor. Bridget was 60, her auburn hair faded to a soft rose gold, her face lined but still beautiful in Finn's eyes. They moved slower than they once had, but they still took walks together every evening that weather permitted, still sat on their porch talking as the sun set, still held hands like young lovers. On a warm June evening in 1922, as they sat on the porch watching their grandchildren play in the yard, Bridget said, "Do you remember what you said to those women at the social, when they were criticizing me?" "I said a lot of things over the years," Finn said with a smile. "You will have to be more specific." "You said my voice was the sweetest sound you knew," Bridget said. "You said it loudly in front of everyone when it would have been easier to stay quiet." "Of course I remember," Finn said. "It was true then and it is true now. Why do you ask?" "I was thinking about how words have power," Bridget said. "Those men who mocked me at the store, their words could have broken me if I had let them. But your words built me up. They gave me strength. They helped me believe that I belonged here, that I was worthy of love and respect." She paused, watching little Thomas, James's oldest son, chase his sister Mary around a tree. "Words can wound or heal, Finn. You chose to heal with yours, and that made all the difference." "You would have been fine without me," Finn said, though his voice was warm with pleasure at her words. "You were always strong enough. Strong enough to survive, perhaps," Bridget said, "but you helped me do more than survive, you helped me thrive. There is a difference." She turned to look at him, her brown eyes still bright despite her age. "I want you to know that I see it, Finn. I see everything you gave me, everything you sacrificed, all the ways you made my life better. And I am grateful every single day." Finn felt his throat tighten with emotion. After nearly 40 years together, she could still move him to tears with her words. "I am the one who should be grateful," he managed. "You crossed an ocean and found me. You loved me even though I was just a cowboy with nothing much to offer. You gave me a family and a home and a reason to wake up every morning. How could I be anything but grateful?" They held each other as the sun set and the children's laughter filled the air, two people who had weathered decades together and emerged stronger for it. The life they had built was not perfect, but it was good. It was real. It was theirs. Finn O'Brien lived to be 72, passing away peacefully in his sleep in 1931 with Bridget at his side. His last words to her were, "Your voice is still the sweetest sound I know." Bridget lived another 12 years, dying at 73 in 1943, surrounded by her children and grandchildren. The O'Brien Ranch remained in the family, passing to James and his descendants, a testament to what Finn and Bridget had built together. Their story lived on in Helena, told and retold, becoming part of the town's history. The house they built still stood on the ranch, preserved by the family as a reminder of where they came from. And sometimes, on quiet evenings, people swore they could hear the sound of a woman singing in a Scottish accent, her voice carrying across the Montana grassland like music, the sweetest sound in all the West.